Hi, this is Laura Johnson from Shining Star Waldorf School. This is a beeswax class for our second grade and anyone else who wants to participate. So we're using the white beeswax today that came in your little bundle, as well as a little bit from the other ones. So while I tell you a story, you can use your white beeswax to make it into a ball. Now, once upon a time, there was a good old woman who lived in a cottage. She spent her days taking care of her garden and knitting and doing all kinds of things around her house, like cooking or harvesting the vegetables and fruits from her garden. Well, in the back of her garden, she grew tulips. The tulips had striped petals, so they were all different colors, reds and pinks and oranges and yellows. And the tulips were big and healthy. Well, spring had come, so the tulips were all ready to burst open in their flowers. Keep working to make this into a ball. Well, one night, when she was going to sleep, she had a cup of tea, laid down in her cozy bed with her very thick woolen blanket and her nice feather pillow, and she was drifting off to sleep when she heard the strangest noise. It sounded like the ringing of little tiny bells, and the laughter of little babies, and the cooing sound like a dove. Well, she went to sleep despite the little noise, and in the morning went out into her garden to see where the noise maybe had come from, for she heard it outside the back. When she went out, she looked at the tulips, and they had all burst open and were full bloom. But she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Her garden looked lovely, the sun was shining, and it was blue sky above. Well, she spent her day in the garden, doing her things in the house, cooking, going on a walk, seeing her friends, and that night went to bed again in her nice warm bed with her thick woolen blanket and her feather pillow. And this night, as she laid down, she heard again the sound of tiny bells, sound of babies' laughters, and cooing sound like a dove. Well, this night she was more curious where the sound was coming from, and instead of letting herself drift off to sleep, she awoke and went to the back. Even in the dark, she could see the garden well because the moon was so bright in the sky. It showed everything in a nice silvery light. Well, when she looked down at the tulips, she saw they were moving back and forth, just a little back and forth, back and forth. And to her surprise and awe, inside each little tulip was a tiny little baby. And it was laughing, because next to each tulip was a little fairy mother. And the little fairy mothers had beautiful silvery wings, and they were rocking the tulips back and forth, cooing the little fairy babies. And as they rocked back and forth, the babies would laugh and start to fall asleep for the night, just like a cradle. Well, the old good woman, she watched for a while, and then she went off to bed once all the little fairy babies were asleep. Well, the next night she did the same thing. She waited and she heard the sound of the little bells and the laughter and the little cooing sounds. She went out and she saw the fairies rocking their babies to sleep. And the babies would laugh and coo and start to drift off for the night. In the daytime, the babies and all the fairy mothers were all gone, and the tulips were as if everything was normal. Well, one day, the little old lady was out working in her garden when, now, I'm making a little bit of a shape. Keep working on making your ball. This is going to be about the shape of an egg, so you can go ahead, try to make it into a nice egg. Well, she was in her garden, And she had some neighbors and they had some children. And the children sometimes came over to the garden to play. Well, one of these children was very young, and this child came over to the tulip bed to see the big blossoms and the big, beautiful striped petals, and they came over and they started to pluck the flowers to make a bouquet. Now the old good woman, she ran over and she stopped the child. She said, "Oh no, never pick these flowers, for they must be left alone to bloom." Well, the child did not understand why she didn't want him to pick the flowers really, but he did stop. Later that day, a bunny from a nearby field hopped into her garden and went over to the tulips to see the beautiful petals. But the little bunny was a little hungry, and he started to try to nibble on one of the stems of the tulips. And the old woman ran out with a broom and swept the bunny away. And the bunny hopped off. Well, that night, she waited and she saw all the fairy mothers come back and rock the babies in their tulip beds and cradle. And my little friend assistant, you might hear my little kitty meowing. Now, that night, the fairies had seen what the older woman had done. She had saved their petals and saved their flowers for their cradle. And so the fairies, after the old woman had gone to sleep, all gathered, and they thought, we should give her a gift. We should give her a special gift. And so the fairies took an egg, just a regular egg, but with their fairy little tiny brushes, they did all kinds of decorations. So students, you should have some other colors in your pack, and you should have some extra colors from last week because we didn't use them all, so you can use those now. And the fairies put little designs all over the egg, and they painted it beautifully. So we can take little pieces of wax and we can make a little flower by pushing the wax onto our egg. There's a little red tulip here, and then we can use a little bit of green. You can make any designs that you want on the outside of your egg. Well, the fairies use their tiny little brushes to make all these little pictures on the outside of this chicken's egg. And they had emptied it so it would never rot, but it would be beautiful as a decoration. Well, the next day, the good old woman went out into her garden, as she always did, and she saw, hidden among the tulips, the most beautifully painted egg she'd ever seen. She picked it up, and as she did, she heard the little ringing of bells, little fairies' bells, and she knew that it was a gift to her. And she brought it inside, and from then on, she made sure to protect those tulips. And that is the end of our story today. So you can keep adding decorations. You can use other waxes from last week or this week, and you can make a little decorated Easter egg, just like from our story. Okay, that's all for today.